What is up, guys? So I am going to be showing you my workflow from Blender to Substance to Unity today. So I hope you enjoy. Alright, so to start off we need to set up our Blender so it looks, I guess, a little bit better for our workflow. So this should be the default Blender. I personally don't care for the timeline. I like to have a little split bar at the bottom, and so I usually have my node editor right here. And I'll pull out a little tab and I'll pull out my UV image editor. So now I have my nodes for all my material work, and then my editor so I can see what kind of images I need and all that good stuff. So I got that set up. Now let's check out the settings we need. Alright, so for the settings, I'll show you what I stick with for my default settings. So for the render tab, I usually keep it 1920 by 1080. And this little slider right here, this is basically, if it's at 100%, it'll render the image at full resolution, right? And if it's at 50, it'll render it at half resolution. If you can even set it to 200 for 3840 by 2160. But I usually keep it at 50%. So I keep this basically all the same unless I'm doing an animation where I need specific frame rates. Alright, so for sampling, you won't really be rendering an image inside of Blender since you'll be going and putting it inside of Unity. So your samples can, usually stay relatively low because you're only going to be using the preview samples. For light paths, same goes for the sampling. Keep it relatively low since you're not going to be rendering any images. So this is what I usually use whenever I am rendering. 6, 0, 3, 3, 3, 0, and then 8 for max transparency. And then performance, I would let it auto-detect your amount of threads because that usually works perfect for me every time. And I have an add-on called Auto Tile Size, which will basically split up our render image into sizable chunks so that there's no, one's 256 and then one's, 150. That way all our tiles are equally sized. So now that we have our rendering settings set up, let's go to our Scene tab. So in this tab, we can set up units for our Blender file. So here we can see we have our metric, imperial, so you can set that up however you'd like. But real importantly, we have color management. So whenever you go to preview your file or your render, if you're using the default view, then it won't look as, accurate as if you were using the Filmic. So what Filmic does is it accurately represents light as a float value, where RGB or default would compress it down to a 0 to 1 scale. This would allow, having sunlight to be more accurately displayed. So your world tab should look something like this, where you have a background and then there's just a base color. So we want to actually use a sky texture. So a sky texture will get us a good start when it comes to environment lighting, which we can use this to adjust the position of the sun in the scene. So let's get down to modeling. As you can see, I've deleted our cube, camera, and light since we won't be needing them. And now is the point where you need to figure out whether or not you want to start with a low poly or start with a high poly. Usually if I'm modeling something inorganic like a chair, a table, I would start with a low poly and then bevel it afterwards for the high poly version. And if I'm starting with something organic like a face, I would start with sculpting it, and then after I finish sculpting, I would decimate it with either the decimate modifier or retopologize it. So for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to be making a table for us. So this next part I'm going to speed up, and then I'll show you how to convert that to a high poly mesh. So now that we have our object modeled, we actually need to give it materials and assign it some high poly bevels. So let's give it materials first. So I want this to be a wood material, so I'm going to create a new material. I'm going to call it wood_table. And then for my metal body, I'm going to call it body_metal. So we have our materials assigned to each object, right? So we have this wooden piece, that's going to be the wood, and then here, that's going to be the body metal. So now we actually need to create a high poly version of this. So I'm just going to make sure both of these are selected and do Shift D and then Enter. That'll create a duplicate in its exact place, and then we're going to move it to the next layer. So on this layer, this is where we're going to create our high poly versions. So let's go ahead and rename these to be the proper Highpoly version. So table underscore high, and then body underscore high. Let's rename that real quick. Okay, so we are going to create our bevels. So the way I like to do this is I like to select some sharp edges, and that'll give us the edges that need to be beveled the most. So I'm going to do Control E, mark them as sharp, and then increase the mean bevel weight and the mean crease. So this is in the rendering or the camera menu, so you access that by pressing N. So I've increased that for that. And I'll just go ahead and do the same on my wooden table real quick. Select sharp, we can see that is in the right place. Mark sharp with Control E, increase the mean bevel weight and the mean crease, and then deselect all. So now we actually need to add the bevel modifiers that will give us that nice little curve on the edge. So some settings I like to use, I like to set the profile to 0.7 and then our limit method to weight. So I always make sure clamp overlap is always on as well, because I don't want to get some weird edges like that, because whenever you turn clamp on, it will automatically fix that for you. So since this is going to be a high poly, we actually don't need to worry about segments as much as if it was a low poly. So I'm just going to give it 9 segments, and then just give it a small bevel. I'm also going to set it to smooth shading. And then let's do the same for our metal body. And then ramp that up. 9. Smooth shading. Weight. Profile of 0.7. And let's just make sure we use the same width as our wooden table. So we can actually see it looks a lot better right there. So next we are going to do UV maps. But before we do that, let's the way I like to see different materials, you actually change the viewport color. So I'm going to make that just a light brown, and in the metal just a darker color. That way I know which material is which. So if I go over here, you can see it reflected over here as well. So here's the low poly with those really sharp edges, and then here is the high poly with the beveled edges. And that's just to add a hint of realism to our model. So before we can export our mesh, we actually need to UV map our mesh. So I'll start with this, and we're just going to use a Smart UV project for this project. I don't like to stretch it because that will give it some weird textures later on in Substance. I would usually keep this around the same, but sometimes I go up to 70. Island margin, so I want to see how much stuff is spaced out. I'd keep that around 0.05 to 0.1. Area weight, same 0.05 to 0.1. And correct aspect, because we want that to be as best as it can be. So we can see we've exported right here. We have our table, and then some small faces on the side, which won't really be seen, but still nonetheless it's fine. So we've UV unwrapped that. Next, let's do our table, or our body. Smart UV project, same settings. So we'll get a little bit more stuff in this one, but it'll all bake out to look completely fine. So let's move on to exporting. Alright, so now that we've created the UVs for our low poly, which we don't need them for our high poly since that's just a baking mesh, we are going to export both the high and low poly. So to export the low poly, you want to select both of these. Obviously make sure there's no modifiers or anything on them. And we can see we have the body and the table selected. So we're going to go export, export FBX. So I usually export FBX because Unity takes it, Substance takes it, and it's usually just my go-to. Export FBX, and I want to export as with selected objects checked, right? So if I don't have selected objects checked, then basically the whole blend file will get exported, and we just want the low poly. So I'm just going to save it as table and export that. And that's good. Deselect everything and then go to the high poly. Make sure our modifiers are applied. and then export that as FBX. Selected objects still working, so table underscore high, export FBX. Okay, now that you have them exported, we're going to move over to Substance Painter. Alright, so now that we're in Substance Painter, we can go ahead and create a new project. I'm going to go New, and I want to select our file. So we want to use the low poly file, so our table.fbx. And so you have a lot of different options for export. I'm just going to use Unity 5 because that's what our workflow is. So you can see it automatically changes to OpenGL because that's the normal format Unity uses. And we can always change it to 4K later, which is usually what I export as, but I'm going to keep it at 1024 right now while we are creating materials. Let's go ahead and create that project. And we can see I have no UV coordinates for some reason. Mesh body has no UV coordinates, so let's go check our file, which we can see that it actually does. So that must mean an export error, so let's re-export that file. Selected, table.fbx. Let's go create that new project again and see if it works. So new, discard, we want to select our table, change it to 1K, create, and we can see it works now. So it must have just been an export error, but now we see we have our table. And this table does not have the bevels as we had on our other one. So we don't have those nice smooth angles right there. So let's get those in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our texture set settings. We want to bake some mesh maps. So I'm going to just bake in 1K for now. For the final one, I would bake in 4K. And I'm going to add a high poly mesh. So these high definition meshes, this is what our beveled one is. So let's click this little button right here and let's add a high mesh. Alright, so that adds that for us. I usually don't change anything else in this. This is mainly if you want to like bake ID maps or anything else, but I want to bake all texture sets. So let's wait for that to bake. Since we're baking at 1K, it actually shouldn't take that long at all, which you can see it's going by pretty fast. And you can actually see some of the bevels start to show up already. But let's see the final. So since this is 1K, we're not going to have the quality or the detail that we want right now, but that is what the 4K map is for. So we have our mesh baked, and that'll also bake position, normals, ambient occlusion, all that. So whenever we go to add some materials and other stuff, it will show up for us. So let's add our materials. So Substance Painter comes with some default materials, but there are other places you can get materials. You can even create your own materials. So I'm just going to go to my texture library. I'm going to drag in a wood that I like. So let's just say I want to use this nice wood right here. So I'm going to drag that in the normal. You actually don't need the normal map. Technically, you can make one without it, but I'm going to be using the normal map since I have it. So I'll bring that back over here. After I dragged it into here, it'll pop up this, right? So this is basically how you define what these textures are. So you can, they're alphas, they're, loots, they're environmentals, or they can be textures. So I just select both of them, select texture, and you can either import them to your shelf, your project, or only your current session. So I'm going to do my current session since I might not want these to be, added in my other one. So I'm just going to click import. As you can see, they pop up right here. It should show up in my all or my textures, and they do. As you see, I have some other textures here from other projects, but here are the two main ones that we just imported. So let's go to the wood table material right here, and we're going to go to layers, and I want to create a new fill layer, because we're going to just fill this whole table with the material that we want. So we have some settings down here. I'm not going to be using height right now since I don't have a height map. I will drag in my base color. As we can see, the texture applies fine. Roughness, I'll keep that out here so I can adjust that manually to get a nice shine on it, but not too glossy, right? So we want just some blurry reflections on there. That looks nice. I'm not going to bother adding any metal since this isn't metallic at all. I'll just drag the normal on there. So we can see the normal. It may not actually give us the reflections that we want. So I'm going to switch to the normal channel of my layers and then just change the opacity. So this is where you can basically decide how much normal you want in your material. So I only want a smidgen. So just like that, we have a little bit of bumpiness, but not a whole lot. So I'll switch back to the base color. So I'll just call this wood. So next, we can start adding surface imperfections or scratches, stuff like that. So we have smart materials, which would be like if you added your own kind of wood here, it would do all that stuff for you. Or we have some smart masks. So these would be for dirt, grime, rust, if you want to like break down the edges a bit. So I'm going to be using, I think some dust and maybe some dirt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a fill layer, and I don't want any color, height, metal, or normals. I just want a roughness, right? So this is going to be what our dust would be, right? So let's find a dust that we want. So we could either use dust dirty, soft, soft 2. Let's try the stain. So we're just going to drag that onto our roughness layer. So I named it roughness right here. So this is going to be our fill rough, and then we're going to add a mask to it. So this mask is going to have settings that we can change, but just from what we see, we can see some of the surface imperfections starting to show up, adding a bit of realism to it. So if you click on your mask right here, you can see some of the settings under Mask Editor. So this is where you can add more contrast in your mask, or you can maybe, what if you wanted, more surface imperfections, stuff like that. So then these are a lot of different settings you would just play around with until you get a good look that you like. So the next, I've added my roughness. We can see with and without. So now I'm going to add a fill layer. I'm just going to call this one scratches. So I don't want color, roughness, metallic, or normal. I just want this to be a little bit less, or a negative height. So that negative height is going to go down into our wood. And I want to find a nice mask that will give us some scratches or maybe some other imperfections. So I think I might go with some spots for now to see how that looks. So we add those on there. We can actually see some dents in our wood now, which is kind of what we want. Add that used look. Speaking of, if we're going to do that, maybe I'll bump up the normal a little bit. Or not the normal, but the roughness. Alright, so we can see those bumps appearing. That looks nice. Alright, so what if I want this this texture, right? So what if I want that to be maybe a little bit more smaller? So we could just turn up the UV scale. I'll just keep it at 2 for now, since that looks pretty nice. So that won't affect any of our other stuff, as you can see, just the wood, since that's on its own layer. So now that the wood is done, let's go to the metal body. So the metal body, let's get a base material on here. So there's a lot of different metals you can use. For this, let's just use an iron. Let's drag an iron on there. We're not going to need this one. Actually, I'm not liking how that's looking. I don't want those imperfections on there quite yet. So I think I'll use a pure. Right, so that pure will give us just our base color. And now we can change how it looks. So maybe I want a little bit less on the rough side, because we'll add those imperfections in later. Right, and then we keep the metallic on the same. Color is fine. So we have that. Now let's add our imperfections. So as before, create a fill layer. I'm just going to call this one roughness, and then we're going to boost. This is what's going to be the rough. So I'll turn that up to there. I'll disable the other parameters. So this is what it'll look like for maximum, roughness. But I think I'll turn it up a bit more. Alright, so let's find a good mask to put on there. So previously, I think we did the dust stained. Maybe we could try just a soft dust this time. Put on there, and we could see just a smattering of dust on that material. But maybe that's not enough, right? Maybe we want something else. So let's try adding something else. Let's try edges scratched. So we can actually add that on top of it, so we still keep the dust, but we're also adding some of those imperfections on there. That looks fine. Then maybe one last one. That's some subtle dust. Alright, that looks fine. So now we can play around with the settings a bit to get the look we want. You know, maybe we want a little bit more, maybe we want a little bit less. So that looks fine for now. Of course, you may want to tune this to your your liking, but for now that looks fine to me. Maybe I will tone down some of those bumps though on our table. So what we could do is go to the height. So we could either change the height from the opacity, or we could just change the material altogether to where it doesn't go down as much. So you can see the less, the bigger the negative number, I guess, or the smaller the negative number, the deeper your height is. And of course, the higher, it looks like bumps now and not dents. So I'll just lower that down, so it's a lot more subtle. Alright, that looks good for now. Now on to exporting and final baking. So for your final bake, we're just going to bake that at 4K, and I'll be right back whenever it's done. Alright, so now I'm back with the 4K bake. So we can still see that they may look a little bit better, but the only reason we can't see the actual detail is because we're still set to 1K. So we need to set that to 4K. It'll take a little while for our project update if you have a bigger project. But I must just click 2K. Whoops. There we are. Okay, so once that finishes, see there's a little bit more detail on our bevels. So now that we have all of our textures created, we need to export. So let's go File, Export Textures. So this is where I would branch off from using this standard Unity 5. So that'll give you your base textures, but there's some other things like the ambient occlusion that you might actually want. So let's just get these settings down first. So I usually use dilation and diffusion with 16 pixels, so that will basically spread out the textures, and I can see that this is still set to 1K, so we actually have to go back to our metal and then set that to 4K as well. That's why we couldn't actually see some of the bevel detail. And now we can see it looks a lot cleaner. So let's go back to export. And so we're still using dilation and diffusion with 16 pixels, PNG, and then I'm going to go to my videos, right? And I'm going to create a new texture folder for my tutorial. So tutorial textures. I'm just going to select that folder. So they're both 4K now, and that's good. So instead of using Unity 5 standard metallic, I want to add some AO, some ambient occlusion in there. So I'm going to select that standard preset right here. I'm going to click plus. I'm going to rename it to Unity plus AO. So we don't actually do that. That's my bad. We actually want to duplicate it. That would be more useful. So I'll keep that to Unity plus AO. And then these are our selected outputs that we could output. I'm not going to use the mixed AO. I think we just want the ambient occlusion. So before we can actually add the input map, we need to create the map to use. So ambient occlusion, that's going to be black and white, so we could just use a grayscale texture. And so this $ mesh will basically stand for the name of the mesh that we're outputting, which is table. And then underscore texture set will be basically what texture you're using. So metal underscore body material or the wood underscore table material. And then I'm just going to go AO. So right now we don't have anything in here, but we can take the ambient occlusion and drag it in here. So from ambient occlusion, we want to grab the gray channel, not the alpha channel. So let's grab that, and that is ready to go. So we go down here, we see Unity plus AO. If we click down on our drop down, we can actually see the AO has appeared as our output. So I'm just going to export those textures, and then I will see you in Unity. Right, so I have a new Unity 2018.1 project pulled up right here, and so let's open up our folder with our textures and our assets. So we're just going to drag these into Unity to import them. So we'll let those import, and there's a couple things we need to change on our textures. We need to make sure, since we exported as 4K, we need to make sure the max size is set to 4K as well. So let's apply those for all of our textures. And next, we're actually going to create the materials and then put the materials on our mesh inside of our game. Alright, so let's create the material for the body and wood. So we'll call this one metal body. We'll create another one, material, wood table. So metal body. We can see this is the albedo, this is the metallics and smoothness, and this is the normal, which it's not set to normal yet, but we can do that whenever we import it, or whenever we add it to the material. So let's add the albedo to our material. Next, we're going to add the metallic, which will also change the smoothness for us. And finally, we're going to add our normal map, which we can see it says it's not a normal map, so it'll fix it for us. So last thing we also need to do, we're going to take the ambient occlusion, drop it on there, and then let's do our wooden table. So let's drag the albedo, metallic smooth, and the normal, and then fix the normal. Alright, let's add our occlusion. So let's drag our table into our scene. I'm just going to set it back to 0. So we can see our table still has flat edges and such. So let's drag our materials onto our table. And we can see those bevels being highlighted where there wouldn't be normally. So let me just create a metallic metal underscore test. So it's going to be full metallic with smoothness all the way up, and we're going to test that on here. So if we were to just have a full metallic, we can see that those bevels would not show up, and they would just look like a regular old table. So if I lower the smoothness a bit, you can see that a little bit better. Those bevels won't show up. So let's add our body back on here. We can see it actually looks a lot better. You can see the surface imperfections showing up as well. So one other thing you could do, just to make it look a little bit nicer, you could add a light or a reflection probe. So I'm going to add a reflection probe in here. Right. So I have a reflection probe right here. You either set it to baked. I'll do real time for now. So let's do baked for now. Set that up here. Make sure it's covering our bottom, and it is. And let's keep that how it is. So I'm going to set. So you could also change the intensity. So if you wanted the reflections to be a little bit better or worse, it's fine. And then also I'm going to create a plane under our table. So it looks like our table is actually standing on something. So I'll just increase the size of that a bit. There, and now we have a table. So I'm going to do is set that at every frame, no time slicing. And then we have our gorgeous looking table that we made in Blender, textures in Substance Designer and Substance Painter, and then brought into Unity. So you can put this in any of your scenes, and it'll look the same because it's textured with PBR. On a side note, I'm going to show you some of the sites where you could get free PBR stuff for your Substance Painter. So like SBS files and SVSARs you can import into your Substance Painter, like wooden materials or metal materials, and I'll show that to you next. So let's show you where to get some free SBS files and SVSARs that you can put in your Substance Painter. So the first site would be share.algorithmic.com, I hope. Maybe it's .org. Okay, good, it's .com. So here we can see a lot of different stuff. So they have a lot more than just materials. They also have masks, smart materials, and then just a bunch of other stuff you could use for your substance painters. Let's go look at some of the materials. Let's just click on wood, for instance. So we see a lot of the different wood materials you could either do for flooring, for tables like we did before. Lots of different projects. I think they have trees as well. So these are all user-generated content. So stuff that people have made and then just released on here for free for us to use. Yeah, so those are some of the wood ones. And they have metal. So you have some man-made, some ground. So a lot of great resources here. So yeah, you would just find one you'd like. Say we wanted this rusty metal right here. We click on that, click download. It'll give you the zip file. You will need to create an account, but once you do, basically everything on here is free to use in your projects. So it'll give you either an SBS or an SBSAR. Just drag one of those into your Substance Painter file, and then import it either as a material or a smart material or whatever it actually is. So that is the Blender to Unity workflow using Substance Painter. I hope y'all really enjoyed this video and got something out of it, because that's really the only reason I make these, so you guys can learn and create some really cool stuff with it. So I'll see y'all next time.